Next up, we're going to have a lightning round with three of our trends from the 2022 Trends in Entrepreneurship report. I am going to turn it over to my colleague at Keenan Flagler Business School, Sekou Bermiss, who is one of the editors for the Trends report. And he's going to tee up our three lightning round presenters. So take it away, Sekou.
All right, thanks, Greg. Appreciate it. Good afternoon, everyone. Officially past the noon hour. Wish again we could be in person, but have been really energized by the presentations we've had thus far, and our lightning round will probably prove to be just as exciting and vibrant. And so a quick note before I introduce our first speaker, which will be Victor, that if you haven't already, check out the Trends report. There's really a lot of really interesting things that have been published in it that are part of it that I think hit on a lot of different facets of entrepreneurship. So on the geography side, a really interesting trend looking at rural entrepreneurship, also localized funding, how a lot of funding still remains localized geographically, and what does that mean? Thinking about individuals, underrepresented entrepreneurs, kind of piggybacking on a lot of what Faye was talking about, organizations, accelerators, how they can be optimally designed, new governance models that we see popping up with social enterprise sorts of organizations. And then, of course, on the regulatory and policy side, the role that government has in crisis, the role that government has in funding entrepreneurship, tax policy, and the like. So there's a little something for everyone there. And those are just the ones you're not going to hear about today. And so with that, I do want to introduce our first speaker, who's going to speak about one of the trends that he wrote. And so our trends are papers from colleagues and practitioners from many kind of walks of life. And one of those that will speak next is Victor Lyonnet. Did I pronounce that the last name correctly?
Yes, perfectly. I mean, except maybe for the last letter that you don't pronounce. So Lyonnet, but that's very good.
Lyonnet. I should have known. See, I was like, is it French or Dutch?
It is French.
It's French. Okay, well then Lyonnet. Victor is joining us from, he joined the Fisher College of Business in the Department of Finance in 2018. He got his PhD in economics at École Polytechnique and visiting HSA Paris for several years. His research interests include financial intermediation, life insurance, corporate finance, and entrepreneurship. He's been a visiting scholar at many very fancy places, both in academia as well as in practice. And we're really honored for him to come and share a bit of his research. And so with that, Victor, I'll give you have about 8 to 10 minutes to present, and then we'll throw it back to me. So Victor.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sekou. Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to take part in this conference. I wish we would all have been able to meet in person and interact all together. But I really do understand why the conference was taken online. Before I get started, I want to say how grateful I am to the organizers for putting the paper in the series. In particular, Greg Brown, David Robinson, and Sekou Bermiss, but also to the staff members of the Kennan Institute, in particular Sydney Bannerman and Ashley Brown. They've been extremely helpful. So thank you all very much. All right, so let me talk about this report that we wrote and this paper that we're currently working on. That is, has a temporary title of The Rising Bar to Entrepreneurship. The question that we're asking in this paper is whether the quality of entrepreneurship has evolved over the past several decades. One well-known fact in the literature is that the quantity of entrepreneurs has gone down, the number of new businesses has gone down throughout the years. The COVID 2020 crisis being an outlier when you look at the long-term trend. And what we do is we're going to propose a new measure of ex-ante startup quality to see whether we can link this decrease in the quantity of entrepreneurs to changes in the quality of the pool of entrepreneurs. And we're going to link those two, and our findings will be that the quantity of startups has decreased over the years, as has been shown in the existing literature, but the quality of the pool of entrepreneurs has gone up. And the two trends are linked. It is in those industries where there has been less and less entrepreneurs that the quality of entrepreneurs, the ex-ante quality of startups has gone up the most. And we actually try and you know, in the most recent version of the paper, we actually try and explain why those industries that have seen the more decrease in the quantity of entrepreneurship and increase in the quality of entrepreneurship. And we find that those industries that exhibit those features are those in which superstar firms have taken over. And I will explain what I mean by that in a second. All right, so what do we do? Well, as my accent gave away already, I'm from France and I know the French data, and I will try and convince you of the advantages of looking at those questions in the French context. We are using several administrative data sets to obtain a detailed yet representative data set on French entrepreneurs and their startups over the years. The first data source that we use is a survey that is conducted every 4 years from 1998 to 2018. And this survey is a large scale one. It's administrative data, so the response rate is very good, and the representativeness of the sample is really what is a key advantage for an analysis. We have a wealth of entrepreneur and startup characteristics at birth that are, you know, some of them are innate characteristics and don't depend on the choices that are being made by the entrepreneurs, which is going to be key for our analysis. We actually use this data and we connect it to like a variety of other data sources. One of them is the firm registry that actually allows us to observe the exhaustive number of new firms created in France over our sample period of 1998 to 2018. We have all existing firms in our data, as well as the newly created businesses. We're going to look at the tax files, which allows us to look at what happens to firms after they are born, whether they actually do well and create a lot of wealth, or whether they do poorly and perhaps even disappear. We also have data on payroll files, which allows us to look at the composition of the startups over the years. We haven't used that as much so far. But the main two advantages of this new data set that we created from scratch is that A, we have an exhaustive data set on new business formation at the level of an economy. And B, we have for a subset of new businesses, we have a representative data set of entrepreneur characteristics. And so what do we do with that? Well, first we confirm the findings of other researchers in the US that the quantity of new startups has gone down throughout the years. So I do not have the 2020 COVID crisis in my sample, but you can see that the long-term trend is that the number of new startups with at least one employee at creation has gone down. The picture is a little different when you look at the total number of startups, including non-employers as well. But from an economic viewpoint, as in the literature, we think that for the economy to thrive and create new businesses, we should look at those startups that actually do employ at least one employee. All right, so we are going to create a measure of startup quality, and we're going to do so in many different ways. But the way that I want to show you today is I'm pretty excited about it. And I think it's a whole encompassing view of like what a business looks like at its birth based on its different characteristics, and how successful we can predict it to be based on those characteristics. So we're going to use many of the characteristics that we observe in the data, but we don't really know which characteristics are associated with success. And actually, even in the literature, people have had a hard time figuring out, given the lack of data on a representative sample of entrepreneurs, people have had a hard time figuring out which entrepreneur characteristics are predictive of success. And we're going to confirm some of the findings in the literature in terms of, which entrepreneurs, how old are successful entrepreneurs, what tends to be their gender, the type of activity that they are creating a business in, etc. And the way we're going to do so is by using machine learning techniques to predict success. So we don't impose a model on the data, we just let the data speak, and we ask a machine learning model that is tasked at predicting success along different measures. We ask this model to tell us which are the most important features to predict success of startups. We then show that we can actually very well predict the success of different startups. But today, what I want to do is I want to focus on those characteristics that that our lasso machine learning model tells us are the most important to determine various measures of success. I cannot sadly go into details, but what I can tell you is that whether an entrepreneur was in the same activity, the same industry before as an employee or as a past entrepreneur is key to predict whether the startup that he or she creates is going to stay alive 5 years down the road. So survival is going to be predicted by whether an entrepreneur has been in the same activity before. So will employment at age 5, value added at age 5, and actually along various measures, this variable seems to be the most important one. Interestingly, some variables predict survival and some others tend to predict success along the employment and value added measures, which kind of suggests that some, like the literature has shown, some businesses will never actually grow that much. And those businesses that will grow the most are not necessarily those that will survive the longest. This is what the people in the literature have called the difference between small and old, small and large versus young and old businesses. All right, so what are our results? The first result is that the startup quality measure that we create has gone up in time. If you look at 1998 to 2018, our predicted survival based on ex-ante characteristics, which is really about the composition of entrepreneurs, not about the actual realized outcome. Survival is actually almost flat. This is, if you zoom out of this very tiny window, the survival of entrepreneur has not changed all that much. However, the predicted value added and employment measures have gone up. And we actually, in the paper, we also look at specific characteristics themselves instead of doing this machine learning prediction exercise. And we find that, this increase in startup quality is actually mirrored by increases in college attendance and in the fraction of entrepreneurs that have worked in the area before, etc. So this is our first result. Quality has gone up. The second result is that this increase in quality is indeed linked to the decrease in the number of startups. We have, on the x-axis, we have the change in the number of startups, and on the y-axis, the change in predicted value added, which is one of our measures of quality. And we find that those industries in which we had less and less firms entering over the years, the quality of this new pool of businesses has gone up the most. And our interpretation is that it's become harder to become an entrepreneur. We have seen less and less of those quote unquote lower quality entrepreneurs enter into industries that see, that as a result see, an increase in the average quality of new businesses. And the latest results that we have are about what's happening in those industries. And I can give you the gist of what we're finding. We find that the productivity of superstar firms is a very good predictor of the increase in market concentration, and therefore how high the bar has gotten into those industries that I just talked about. So an increase in the productivity of superstar firms in a given industry is going to lead to more firm exits, which has been documented in the literature, but also can explain all of the results that I told you about, namely that there has been less and less business formation, and that the average startup quality has increased over the years. And just to wrap up, because I'm already running a little bit late, I think, what we show in this working paper is that entrepreneurship dynamism cannot only be measured with quantity. Quality is also very important. Quality has not been measured in a convincing way in the literature, we argue, because in the literature people have looked at realized outcomes, whereas we look at innate abilities of entrepreneurs, irrespective of how they actually fare. So we can actually tell apart the changes in the composition of entrepreneurs from changes in the economic environment. we find that entrepreneurs have become better and better. And this effect is driven by those industries in which superstar firms have taken over and made it harder for everybody to survive, but also enter into the industry. With that, I can let Sekou take over.
All right. Thank you very much, Victor. That was excellent. We do not, unfortunately, we do not have time for Q&A, but if there are some questions in Q&A that you want to look at and perhaps answer offline, that'll be useful. All right. So next up in our lightning round, we have Waverly Ding. Waverly is an associate professor of management and organizations at the University of Maryland's Robert H. Smith School of Business. She earned her MBA and PhD at University of Chicago. Before joining the faculty at the Smith School, she was the assistant professor at the Haas School at the University of California at Berkeley. And Waverly is going to speak to us today about her trend, which is the entrepreneurship penalty in job searches.
So I'm going to talk about a recent paper that is under review at SEJ right now, done together with my colleague Deborah Shapiro and Hyun Lee, who I think she's on the market right now. She's now a postdoc at University of Toronto. This is the wrong slide, obviously, sorry. So what we're going to kind of show in this particular research is a trend that we're calling entrepreneurship or post-entrepreneurship penalty in the job market, which we find it quite alarming, and then show some practical implications of this trend. All right. So to start with, why do we care about this question? It's rooted in my own teaching experience and experience talking with entrepreneurs before even getting into entrepreneurship. I think it started even back when I was teaching Silicon Valley, kind of in the part-time MBA program. The tech entrepreneurs, very often they're working for Google and a big firm, and then thinking about going into entrepreneurship. And the major question they're facing is that, should I go in or not? And what would be the consequences? Because that opportunity cost issue is always there. And now that I'm focusing on teaching undergraduates, they're facing the same problem. I think across both graduate MBA level and undergraduate level, this is a crucial question if we care about entrepreneurship rate overall in the society, because the potential entrepreneurs are asking questions about what if I fail, then what's going to happen, right? So that prompts us to start to think about this post-entrepreneurship question more seriously. And if we look into the research on entrepreneurship, I think we have developed quite substantial research on the antecedents of entrepreneurship, but not enough to understand what happens after. Because after all, with the general statistics is that over 50% of entrepreneurs exited after 2 to 5 years, right? So this is a question that matters for entrepreneurship research overall. So this is how we kind of designed our research to answer this question. So we conducted in 2018 a experimental survey research design to address this question. What we did is to recruit about 300 or so managers, actual managers working in firms. These are all US citizens and having hiring experience before they join our survey experiment. They are on full-time jobs, have at least 2 direct reports and 5 years of full-time working experience. So we paid them to participate in our experiment. So what we did in the experiment is to give every manager a set of 4 resumes, right? And these 4 resumes are supposedly identical, and we have tested them to be identical, and let's call them resume templates, right? And so each person get 4 identical resume templates with the only variation on 2 items. One is the name of the resume, which indicates man, woman. The other is the most recent job episode, which you're going to see at the very top, right below the name and address information, right? And then we experiment there, whether or not that last experience is showing as the founder of a company, and in the control condition, it's going to show as an executive position with the same name of the company, right? So to get it clear that it's the experiment setup is basically using almost quote unquote identical resumes, which is randomized across the 275 participants. So half of the participants are going to see resumes, the same resume template that is showing the person as an entrepreneur, and the other half is showing not as an entrepreneur, right? So then we give them a task description and ask the subject to pick out of the 4 resumes one that they think is the best fit for the job. And it's the same task across all 4 resumes, right? And then after that, we give them some questionnaire and asked about the recruiters' characteristics, their own entrepreneurial intention, their characteristics of their firms, and where they live and work. Right. So here are some main findings. So finding number 1, we did find a penalty against the ex-entrepreneurs. So depending on the models, on average, ex-entrepreneurs in our experiment are showing a probability of being hired as lower by 23 to 29% than non-entrepreneurs. So we do see an average penalty effect if people have entrepreneurship experience. However, the good news here relating to finding number 2 is that it depends. It depends on who is hiring, right? And we're kind of drilling into 2 aspects of this depends factor. So if the hiring manager is telling in the survey that he or she himself has thought about entrepreneurship, then there's basically a better situation. So the biggest penalty is handed out by those hiring managers who told us they haven't even thought about entrepreneurship in their past, right? So recruiters without any entrepreneurship aspiration are much less likely to hire job applicants with entrepreneurship past. So the second dimension we were trying to kind of drill into this depends, factor is the size of the recruiter's firm. So we surveyed on, what's the size of your firm, and it turned out that for those recruiters that are telling us that working for firms above 5,000 employee level, that penalty is significant, but for the smaller firms below 5,000 employee level, the penalty is kind of like smaller or non-significant. So together, what do we find? The combination of these 2 dimensions is that recruiters of smaller sized firms and those who have entrepreneurial aspirations themselves do not give out penalty to post-entrepreneurs. But the other categories, either recruiters in large firms or recruiters himself or herself doesn't harbor any entrepreneurial intention, they tended to penalize ex-entrepreneurs. So to conclude, what are the practical implications? We see 2 practical implications, one for entrepreneurs and the other for the firms, right? For entrepreneurs, I think the practical implication is that matching matters, right? So it seems to us that larger firms are more likely to hold bias against them. So if entrepreneurs do need to seek jobs at larger firms, they need to work harder to try to overcome that bias. But more importantly, I think for firms, what we have found matters a lot. So a lot of firms, particularly older firms, want to increase their innovativeness and entrepreneurial spirit. Actually, at the executive level, like to hire ex-entrepreneurs. But then for those firms, the message is that it matters whether you're sending out the right person, right? So if you have used the wrong person who are not kind of entrepreneur oriented themselves, then you're not likely to get the result. So in that case, maybe some de-bias training would help a lot. So generally, those are the two kind of practical implications we derive from our paper. And I'll end there and hand it back to Sekou. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Waverly. Appreciate it. And so because we're running short on time, I want to quickly transition us to our last speaker. And that is Sophie Calder-Wang, who is a professor at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. And she's going to be speaking about the trend she wrote about, which is diversity and performance in entrepreneurial teams. Sophie, it's all yours.
First of all, I want to thank you, the organizers, for putting together this fantastic forum, and very much appreciate you including me here. Now, for today's talk, I'm going to focus on understanding what is the performance implication of diversity. To give you a little bit of a backdrop, I think we all realize that there are a variety of workplace diversity initiatives that are being proposed or implemented across the globe, starting from, the Norwegian quota on board members, California mandated board diversity. I think, in today's corporate environment, that's very much front and center in many of the teams. However, if we turn the issue of diversity within entrepreneurship, I think we all agree that entrepreneurship is an important engine to growth, but there are actually relatively few empirical studies in terms of whether there is benefit in diversity for the entrepreneurial community. Now, this study is going to answer these questions. And in particular, I'm going to focus on what is the performance impact of horizontal diversity, meaning across team members, and what's the performance implications of vertical diversity. And in our context, you can think of between entrepreneurs and their board members or VC investors. Now, to answer such a big question, I need to ground it in a specific setting. And what I actually have is I have a entrepreneurship course that was run at HBS for over 4 years. What this course affords us to do is a form of random assignment that allows to actually get out this question in the more causal fashion. So let me spend a minute to tell you the setting, just so that you can see how the results connect to the setting. So this is a class where, every student together with their 90 classmates take, and they are asked to form an entrepreneurial team for the semester to come up with a business. They later on get evaluated by a panel of outside judges, which is comprised of actual VC investors and experienced entrepreneurs. So, as much as a classroom setting is concerned, this is fairly realistic. Now, what is really unique and interesting about the setting is that unbeknownst to the HBS administrator, they created a pretty ideal experimental setting for researchers. So back in 2013, they have an assignment mechanism there whereby they actually used a computer algorithm to randomly assign people into these entrepreneurial teams for this class. However, in later years for 2014, 2015, and 2016, they said, okay, I'm not going to assign people to work together, but I'm actually going to allow people to form their own teams. So right there, you can see we have two sources of random variation. One is I have this computer who actually is assigning people not based on unobservable selection. And then you have another comparison where you can compare the scenario where, you can have some sort of intervention by a computer versus an environment where it's free for all. So this allows us to do three things. Number one, it allows us to quantify the extent of homophily in team formation. Now, I guess sociologists and economists and also, everyday life teaches us that homophily is just such strong factor and a fact of life. We see very strong homophily in team formation along the lines of race and ethnicity, along gender, even along other acquired characteristics like sharing the same undergraduate institution or having worked in the same industry. When you allow people to choose their own teammates, predictably, they are very much more likely to form teams with members that share these characteristics with them. This is perhaps not surprising. This is expected. We can quantify these in this controlled setting. We say, okay, looks like, people really match on race, ethnicity, and gender. They match, a little bit less, but they still do very statistically significantly along school and industry ties. Okay. And we can drill it down a little bit further. It seems that, this is equally strong for men and women. It's strong among, across all racial and ethnicity groups. And then, if you peel a little bit further, you can see, if anything, we see a little bit stronger tendency for homophily among men than women in our student body. So this is the homophily result, but what we really care about is that do they matter? Do they matter in terms of performance? So to measure the impact of diversity on performance, we first have to construct a measure of diversity, which is just, counting the number of shared ties, or you can think of counting number of ties where two team members differ from each other. That would be a measure of diversity. So if we plot, for example, the diversity score on the x-axis, here a score of 1, which means every pair none of the student pairs in the team share a common characteristics, and a diversity score of 0 means everyone are the same, share the same racial or ethnic background. Here I'm plotting ethnic diversity, racial and ethnic diversity. This is saying that, in fact, in the 2013 cohort, when computers are randomly assigned people for teams that happen to be assigned and happen to be more diverse, the performance is actually worse than these teams where, when they're randomly assigned, where the team is more homogeneous. So you have this negative slope. And I think we have to pause a little bit here, because this is actually saying there is a performance penalty to diversity. And I think we can debate and introspect the mechanism through which this is happening. I think this is beyond the scope of what we can reliably predict in terms of what exactly is the channel. But what is interesting is that when we look at the 2014 to 2016 cohorts, when we have the same type of regression run, what you see is that the relationship between performance and diversity is actually a lot weaker, in that there is not as much of a penalty from diversity when you allow people to choose their own teammates. So it seems like what really is a bad idea is to force people to work in a diverse team that they otherwise wouldn't form themselves. Whereas in the case of organic formation, when I'm willingly to choose someone to work with someone that look different, either demographically or in terms of background from me, that seems to not having as much of a performance problem. And I think, we can say this is, just about this class, but I think more broadly, we can have some lessons about how do we think about implementing diversity interventions so that we don't end up in this 2013 land where we have a negative implication from putting people together when they actually differ very much in terms of their backgrounds. So that's the first main result, which is there is a performance penalty, but when you allow people to form organically, it actually restores some of the diversity benefit. The second main result is we look at the diversity implication in terms of the vertical dimension. And in our case, it's the match between student and faculty members. And we have actually random assignment of faculty members across all the students throughout these 3 years. And what we find is that, interestingly, the blue bars are when the section leader is a female section leader, and the Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4 indicates the quantile in terms of how big of a fraction is the team that are women. So what we're seeing is that when the section leader is a female section leader, teams with more women actually do better. So you see the blue bars are actually sloping upwards. However, when the faculty member is actually a male section leader, what you see is actually this is flat line. So what this seems to be saying is that female students, especially when there are more female students in the team, they do better when their faculty leader is a female, but that doesn't seem to matter so much when their faculty member is a man. And, you know, like in this class context, the section leader plays a role not as a teacher, but actually more as a guidance, providing guidance to the team's business and planning, and in very much similar ways in which an entrepreneurial teams might deal with other vertical relationships in practice. So to conclude, I think with an eye on time, we hope this incredible empirical setting that we happen to walk into at HBS not only allows us to quantify that we are all homophilous in terms of forming teams, we all like to work with people that look like us, but more importantly, that, you know, when not done properly, there could be a performance degradation when you have diversity, and it can be alleviated if you allow people to form team organically, although that actually is at the cost of lower level of diversity on average. And lastly, to wrap up, you know, there is very strong evidence of performance implication in the vertical dimension, where teams with more women do better when they're advised by a female faculty leader. And that's perhaps something that's more practically implementable when we think about how to foster investment into founders that are perhaps not traditionally being the focus of the venture capital market. So with that, I know this is a very short overview of the paper. If you have any questions, suggestions, or what other directions to take this to, feel free to reach out. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sophie. That was great. Thank you also to Waverly and Victor for their presentations.